I'm advancing the interest of those South Africans who need to have access to broadband and to broadband connectivity.
The end of the SABC, lest it become another post office. Because I think that South African companies under the current law are kind of taxed twice. Well, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of interest around South Africa and our relationship with the US, President Donald Trump and many of his supporters. And of course, one of the key people in his inside circle is Elon Musk. And Elon Musk, of course, has a business that has a history. He himself has a history with South Africa, having been born here. But one of his businesses, STARLINK, has got a history that predates the election of Donald Trump. And suddenly, with the visit of President Cyril Ramaphosa to Washington, this got thrust back into the cauldron, which is the idea of STARLINK investing in South Africa. And the minister in charge joins us today. I'm very, very excited to have you here for the first time. Minister of Communication and Digital Technologies, Malatsi. Welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, no, let's sort of. I know that there's a lot more to. Suddenly, this has become all the news, but it's a big portfolio that you're in charge of, and I've got to say that it's a wonderful, bright spot to see somebody like yourself in that position, prepared to tackle some of these issues, because I think in the modern world, digital technologies, communications has become it's the new mining of the 21st century, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very major portfolio with a lot of potential, some of it untapped, particularly in our case, but it has grown to a lot of significance in terms of its role towards the economy and the economic aspirations of the country. When you look, for instance, at the digital economy and how much it's going to contribute to our economic growth, it starts underscoring the importance of this sector and why policy making in this space matters and can be so instrumental to unlocking the investments that our country and economy needs, creating those type of jobs, but most importantly, sparing entrepreneurial creativity and freedom. We live in the digital age, right? The future of work, entrepreneurship, doing business, and even learning has been significantly and will continue to be significantly influenced by technological evolution and innovations that are coming up.
Yeah, and the other thing that happens within the digital space is the ability to almost leapfrog over some of the problems of the past, right? By problems of the past, talk about infrastructural problems of the past. So, for example, if a country, and South Africa sort of fits half into this category, didn't have telephones in every house, office, etc. Cell phones have meant that you could leapfrog that problem by having cell phones, and that's obviously a massive incentive for the country, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I think it's also important to put everything into perspective in this space. The point you make about the need to leapfrog is particularly important because it is informed by recognition that there are areas, whether be it in digital broadcasting, for instance, because even the way we consume and interact with news has completely changed, right? And how policy making in that space should be geared towards a balance. And it's a very tricky balance at times and very, very contested at striking a balance between obviously, commercial entrepreneurial freedom, law abidance and fairness, and also ensuring that you don't stifle competition, for instance, in the space. So the consideration of these multiple factors make policy making and regulation in our sector in particular to be highly contested, but it requires sober heads. It requires a lot of due diligence because inaction, as much as action, has devastating consequences if not done properly in our space.
And of course, that portfolio specifically has had a real problem in the last, ever since it almost coincides perfectly with the birth of the new South Africa. It has a real problem with speed, because sometimes to get the way the sort of legal processes works, to get stuff passed, you might be writing for technology that's no longer applicable.
Yes, and I think, in fairness, and I can only speak, with a lot of eloquence about developments in our democratic dispensation, but some of those mechanisms were put in place are necessary, because they provide layers to also empower the public to make contributions towards policy making. But the other point you make, which is about, and this is going to be a constant, elusive pursuit of finding the right pace to respond adequately to, the evolution of technologies in the space, the evolution of even innovation, and ultimately the question, how much is appropriate for regulation and how much should be left to the market mechanics to determine. And it's also important in all of this because there is often an effort to bastardize government interventions when instruments of regulation are being put on the table, that there is also a responsibility that players in the market, and this goes to businesses, that there has to be a consistent expression and determination to doing things within the confines of the law. And making sure that there is consistency, and that what they also agree to, which is applicable in some regions, when it's done here, it's seen in that same light, and there isn't an opportunistic element to bastardize regulation because it's done from a South African perspective. I think for us as a country, what we need to do is avoid over bureaucratizing the state, as ultimately it can contribute to stifling efficiency as a start, and secondly stifling the volume and the level of investments that our country needs. And the two can happen together, because there's also some false narrative that any pursuit that seeks to advance, for instance, attracting investments and job creation as a source to doing a decision, it means that it is influenced by commercial interest, and that there is some conspiracy that seeks to undermine the will of the people and our sovereignty, and that isn't the case.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, but of course, and starting at the end first, because there's obviously many aspects to your job that I would like to touch on. But I'm sure many people that are watching have got one thing in mind, and that is your draft policy the policy that you drafted for the ICT sector, which I saw you in another interview say, look, you had no idea that there was a visit going to Washington that happened to coincide.
Can I correct that?
Yes,
yes. I said, when we started working on the policy directive, which was as early as September last year, I would not have the foresight that there would be an upcoming state visit in May. And I keep making the point, and it's a very important point, because there is a lot of suspicion about the timing, about the developments. The truth of the matter is, on the 4th of October last year, I released a public statement after we had submitted the draft policy directive to ICASA to give them an opportunity to comment on, because that is what the law actually stipulates. It stipulates in Section 3 of the Electronic Communications Act that, a minister can issue policy directives on matters relevant in his portfolio that seek to advance national policies. We did that to ICASA. They responded, I think, sometime early this year or late last year, and we spent considerable amount of time going through their response. And in the final determination, we realized that there is still sufficient ground, both legally sound and procedurally correct, for me as the minister to proceed with the policy, with the policy directive. We are now at the stage which, in my view, is a very, very instrumental ingredient of our democracy, which is the public submissions period, wherein the public and any other interested stakeholder in society now has 30 days to make their contributions to the policy. And we have to review those submissions fairly, rationally, and do so with one thing in mind, that what emerges out of there would inform the final shaping of the policy directive.
Yes. Now we know what we're talking about, but to anybody out there who's a little bit confused as to what we're talking about, and I'm going to just sort of give a headline, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the draft policy is within the realms of ICT, communications and technology, in place for companies investing in South Africa, that there's an option of an equity equivalence instead of ownership forsaking for means of complying with BEE. If that's correct.
So yes. So that's partially correct. So in a nutshell, the policy directive seeks to settle the question around the consistent application of equity equivalent programs in the whole of the ICT sector. Why is it important that we do that? The Broad-Based Economic Empowerment Amendment Act of 2013 makes provision for two potential avenues if you are a multinational that wants to do business in South Africa. The one option is sell at least no less than 30% of your ownership to South Africans, or pursue the equity equivalent program. And in order to satisfy the equity equivalent program requirements, there are up to five set of conditions. Invest in research and development, a demonstration that there is investment in job creation and infrastructure, enterprise development, training and development, research and training and development, and fifthly, which is applicable in each and every sector, towards the upliftment of that sector. In our case, that would include any means or any work that promotes digital inclusion. In this case, it could be how the expansion of broadband connectivity can help South Africans to get more connected. And the reason we do that is because in 2021, ICASA, which is the regulator, introduced regulations around ownership in the issuing of licenses in the telecommunication space. And the framing of that regulation meant that there was a singular focus on the size of ownership as a means of getting in. And that represents a closure of the secondary option, in fact, not a secondary, an equally available option being the equity equivalence program. And we are saying it is difficult to justify having one regime for entry of doing business in the country being applicable in other components of our sector. And that is why we have businesses like Microsoft and IBM existing in South Africa and operating on the basis of the equity equivalent program.
And what kind of programs have they instituted as an equity equivalence?
Well, it's a series of those.
Yes.
Investment in research and development, working together with universities, supporting bursary programs for postgraduate learners and undergraduate learners in the field of ICT. Obviously, the number of jobs in which they've created in the sector through the people that they employ working for them and their subsidiaries, the contribution towards enterprise development exhibited in the number and the volume of business that they allocate to local businesses. And another point linked to that is all of these initiatives, the ultimate beneficiaries must be historically disadvantaged people, right? So
as opposed to South Africans.
So yes, right. So the point that we are saying is that the legislation envisioned that there would be 2 points of entry. any regulation must speak to the spirit of that legislation. Because also, when the Electronic Communications Act was amended in 2014, it spoke about the fact that while the current ownership structures, while the current ownership requirements are in place, they must be set in such a way that they are consistent with national laws, and national laws that speak to our transformation and empowerment laws. So the equity equivalent program is an enhancement of already existing empowerment laws. On the it doesn't represent, and there's been a very concerted effort to frame this way to say, this is a departure from broad-based black economic empowerment. It's not. And I understand why that narrative is being driven. That narrative is being driven to say that you've got a DA minister who is somehow advancing causes that are against the empowerment of South Africans.
Yeah. It's even worse than that. They're saying here's a DA minister who's advancing STARLINK because it happens to coincide, as we said at the start. There's a coincidental timing issue here.
I'm advancing the interest of this government.
Yes.
I'm advancing the interest of South Africans who put us into government to be able to deliver. I'm advancing the interest of those South Africans who need to have access to broadband and to broadband connectivity and meaningful connectivity, so that they can participate fully in the digital economy. I'm advancing the interest of a government that wants to be in a position where there is fair, consistent and equitable application of the laws of our country across all the sector. I would never advance interest of individuals. The responsibility we have been given on is to always advance the interest of our country.
If this has been in place, and it has already been taken up by some multinationals, has there been any studies as to whether these equity equivalents actually move the needle at all?
Well, I think in terms of studies and measurement, DTIC does that. The Department of Trade and Industry and Competition does that. And it's important to clarify this point that is useful in any conversation about the equity equivalent programs, that they are not an indefinite license to do business in South Africa. They are for a specific period of time and renewable. And their renewability depends on the satisfaction that the relevant department and ultimately the Department of Trade and Industry has in terms of its satisfaction about delivering on those 5 key components. And that is why, and I made the example, earlier this year, you would remember that Microsoft made a major announcement about its investment in South Africa. President Cyril Ramaphosa headlined that event together with the president of Microsoft. And that was an expression of their continued investment in South Africa.
So you mentioned earlier that this sort of second channel to comply with the law is available only to multinationals. So in other words, if you are a South African company in the ICT sector, this isn't available to you.
No. So and it's important to clarify this. So if you're South African, you are a local resident, right?
Yeah, but you basically the law really
it's available.
We'd save a lot of paper if we said the only one excluded are white males. Really.
Perhaps, but I think the law is very clear that whether you are a multinational or local and wanting to operate in South Africa, if you've got a core joint component of that structure, that is fine. But there are these 2 avenues for doing business in South Africa for multinational companies, and they make provision for South Africans to participate in the economy, and they make space for international companies to play a role in the economy.
Because the point that I'm leaning towards is by having this other option, are we once again, heaven only knows. Obviously some of our comrades are very good at business because they're driving G-Wagons and I'm not. So, they clearly...
But they're your comrades, right?
They're the comrades. So they do particularly well out of this law. But to as we've seen a demolition of the South African economy while we've got all of these hurdles to jump over. And I'm saying, I'm thinking about it, it all sounds great, and let's say your draft policy goes, how is this actually enhancing the economy?
Well, how it will enhance the economy is a door that is available for other investors in other areas, is currently not available for potential new entrants into the market. And we are dealing in a space which you acknowledged earlier, and it's a 4-point that the digital and technological communication space is one that is constantly evolving, with new solutions emerging on a constant basis. And there will come a time, and there could be a time, wherein there is appetite for those technologies and their advancements to take place in South Africa. And we should be looking at how we use regulation as an instrument that can maximize prospects of our country to attract those investment and lead to the fulfillment of one of the key goals of this administration, which is the pursuit of inclusive growth and job creation.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just sort of I've got mentally a little bit stuck, because all I see is red tape, different shades of red, but still red tape.
No, it's not, because this is not the introduction of a new layer.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't be red tape at all. It is basically saying that whenever regulations are made, I think intently their objective, as it should be, is to give further meaning to what the act and legislation says, not represent an ambiguous interpretation of that or a departure from that.
And would you say it's not within the purview of your role as a minister to say, should this exist at all? Do you know what I mean? This other hurdle that I'm putting in front of these.
But I'm not putting another hurdle, yes, which is the point that I keep trying to correct. I'm not putting another hurdle, and I'm not doing a loophole. I'm saying that the basket of our empowerment laws provide for 2 points of entry. And let those 2 points of entry be available at all times in all spaces of our sector for potential entrants. Yes.
To everybody. Local and foreign.
So that there is parity and there is the same rules applicable to everyone.
Yeah, because one would imagine that if you got that in terms of your draft policy, if you got a proposal from a local company that says, look, I already employ South Africans, tick. I already pay their salaries, tick. I pay taxes. I train them. I do this, I do that. As a course of my normal business, will that go towards them meeting that hurdle?
Yes, that would go towards that. But there's also an important layer, because we must also separate processes, right? Ultimately, in consideration of an application, let's say for a class or an individual electronic license, that adjudication lies with ICASA, right? And it can set out, areas that it wants to be satisfied that those are fulfilled. But that can happen once the 2 points of entry are available. And we are saying that those should be permanently available in the entirety of the sector. Because let's take back in a very simplistic way, right? If equity equivalent programs were not applicable in South Africa, you would not have Microsoft operating in South Africa in the manner that it is currently operating in South Africa. You would not have BMW operating in South Africa in the manner that it is currently operating in South Africa.
Sure.
So when we speak about parities, making sure that the same things that are applicable already in components of this sector, let them be applicable throughout the sector.
Yeah. I mean, I just sort of interrogating the point, because it feels to me that you've got a great chance of doing it if you're Microsoft, BMW, even STARLINK, for example, but not so much if you're a South African company.
What would be the hindrance?
because I think that South African companies under the current law are kind of taxed twice, if you want to call it that way. They'd have to do the equity part, and the normal course of business won't be recognized.
Yeah. Look, let's not complicate or overcomplicate, the mechanics of how that would work. And that's why the DTIC has a regular assessment of the effectiveness and compliance of businesses towards their equity equivalent programs obligations. Yeah.
Okay, so let's deal with the two issues before we move on from this particular discussion. For starters, have you had any discussions yet or any approaches yet from STARLINK?
No.
Okay, so that's easy enough. Now, some of your GNU partners are not very keen on this. Right.
Which ones?
Most specifically the ANC, that seem to have doubled down. They seem to be sort of trying to get that 14.5% back from MK.
No, I'll stick to this topic at hand.
Let's stick to the topic, but I'm saying within the context, they're not hell of a keen
No, it's
on
very
this.
interesting. I think there are, as is the case with the ANC in many an instance, different versions of their position on any issue, right? So even what is happening now isn't surprising. If you looked, and I hope we could get it and you're able to go through it, the ANC released a statement on Wednesday from Luthuli House on this draft policy directive, and it said, amongst others, three things. Equity equivalent programs are not a new thing in terms of, a bouquet of empowerment laws. It said, secondly, that regulatory reform is necessary given what our country's aspirations are. 3, it said that it is looking forward to making its submission. It is looking forward to making its submission on this matter during the draft policy directive. The ANC members on the portfolio committee just a day before had a very oppositional stance. And I give back the point that, of course, there's going to be robust discussions. I guess whenever the conversation around empowerment and transformation in South Africa takes place, one has to be mindful of the fact that it invokes a lot of emotions. It invokes a lot of emotions in that debate, and rightfully so, right? And that in that conversation, one should always be mindful of what are the facts and what are the fears, and how do we adequately deal with the facts so that the fears are not misplaced.
Yes.
Where there are any. And look, portfolio committees and executives should and must have healthy, robust interactions. That is about accountability, and that is also about recognizing executive authority, because there are specific powers that ministers are conferred to in order to enable us to do our job consistently. You might not like that, and I'm not referencing you in particular. You might not specifically like that, but you can't delegitimize a minister's efforts to do their work on the basis that they've been given powers to do so. More so when their actions are in line with the law.
Yeah, I do remember a similar situation. Sadly, I'm this age when I can't remember certain things. And one of the most powerful and justifiable problems that, in continuing with apartheid was taxation versus representation. Can you tax somebody when they don't have the vote? Right, that's for South African citizens back in the day. And now I suppose you've got a situation where white South Africans are taxed, but yet they're disadvantaged. But the tax is at 100% of the tax rate. But the upside is at 70%, because if you start a business and it is successful, you have to dilute. So that's why it's such an emotional issue at the root. It goes back to exactly what the problem was back in the 80s, which was can one have taxation without representation? So it's getting to that point, and that, I presume, is where the argument will go. But that's not for us to decide.
So I think it is important to always bear in mind in discussions around transformation, empowerment in our country, that there is a history that South Africa has with the topic of empowerment and transformation. And that there is also a dissatisfaction with how empowerment has been executed, right? And that has, that has germinated a lot of the anxiety that is prevalent in conversations about this. And I always say it is important in these conversations to look at what the ultimate benefit is. Because too often, and naturally so, individuals, groupings, advocacy groups can look at self-interest and individual impact rather than what is the overall ultimate impact on the instrument that are being provided for here.
Yes.
And what is the right way. And that can always be adjudicated, by society without being legislated.
Yeah. Now, the interest that could be magnificent for the country could be greater access to the internet, which you laid out earlier has got so many benefits. And then I want to go on to this point, moving on from there. One would imagine that let's just use the case of, satellite bandwidth being available. We still have a tremendous problem with data costs in this country. And that problem seems to be absolutely, avoided by everybody that could do something about it. And if I had a monopoly, I'm also not going to raise my prices. I mean, why should I?
So you're not going to lower,
I'm not going to lower my prices. Sorry, I might raise them. But, in South Africa, obviously those companies that drive those prices comply with the law, and they understand how difficult it's going to be for any competition to comply with the law and get those licenses, so they can make the pricing whatever they feel like. And they're major contributors to political parties. So you're kind of in a bit of a bind here. Do you think there's any chance that we're going to get lower data costs that mirror anything in the rest of the world?
No, I think it's possible, and the possibility is based on the recognition that let us factor into the conversation the state of our economy first, right? And let us look at what makes thriving economies to do so, particularly in the age of digital connectivity and the power it unlocks into unleashing, new sets of livelihoods, new markets for businesses, and new avenues for learning purposes. And that in that space, when there is also competition, the ultimate beneficiary becomes the consumer, right? And there's gotta be balanced because, governments exist for all of the people that it serves, right? We can have a philosophical debate about that, but it does, right? Because government must serve all its people, and it must always try to ensure that the indigent, for instance, they are instruments of relief towards the indigent. So now coming back to this conversation, right? If we're able to as government on our part on the infrastructure projects for connectivity, able to extend broadband connectivity to rural areas, townships, informal settlements, mining towns, farming towns, the availability of that infrastructure, the reliability of that infrastructure and access will have an ultimate benefit towards the cost to communicate, right? You can make also a legitimate argument to say that the more players in the space, the more competition, the more likely, the cost to communicate will also go down. there could be another instrument, which would be, and this has its own ramifications in a way, because you don't want to unleash an unhealthy determination on the part of government to start setting prices, in any sector whatsoever. But if you asked the public right now, and the general public sentiment, rightfully so, is that the cost of data in South Africa is expensive.
Well, I happen to sadly have a daughter who works in London, and she pays £20 a month for unlimited data, high speed, anywhere she goes, right? What's the equivalent of that? 400 Rand a month, anywhere, digital, all the time. It's not even comparable to anything you can get in South Africa. So, the answer is obviously yes. It would be nice if the economy was bigger. Maybe people would compete, but the problem's competition, quite simply. We do have a duopoly in the digital space, and they're taking full advantage of it. And more regulations, I'd imagine, just keeps out more competitors. I would imagine.
And that shouldn't be the basis of regulation. Regulation should enhance competition and healthy participation in the space.
Yeah, well, let's hope we're on the way. Let's quickly touch on some of the older technology that still exists.
Yeah.
One of those beauties in your portfolio is the SABC, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do their lifts work in their building yet?
Yes. I'm not sure if all of them work.
Yeah, I know that they work to the executive suite. I love that one. The executive
when last were
suite
you at the SABC?
Lift, I was there regular. I was there last year, but at that point there was a bit of stair walking. But but I'm saying, what is the state of the SABC now?
Look, no, the SABC, there are two things that I always say in recognition of the current state of the SABC. The SABC has been beset by a lot of what I call historical developments, from various tenures of leadership in the past that took it towards a particular path. That meant that, for instance, there wasn't sufficient investment in new technologies, and seeking out partnerships and transactions that are beneficial to the SABC. And also having questionable leadership in the past, right? Having come into the portfolio and dealing with the current board, the current management, for a time such as this, there couldn't have been more capable people. The current board and the current SABC management, represented by the CEO, have got the expertise, the values that are needed to turn around the SABC. It will take time. It will take time because one of the fundamental challenges that it faces currently is revenue generation. And that is compounded by the fact that, one, the SABC has a universal mandate, public mandate, right? That means that a certain amount of hours on SABC platforms must be geared towards, educational, nation building, or even including news. And in the highly competitive broadcasting and media space that we are in, those restrictions, that are in line with the mandate of what a public broadcaster should fulfill, come with their own burdens. And those burdens means very limited time to schedule certain things at specific time frames in order to maximize potential advertising revenue that can then help you with the question of sustainability. And the other issue is the reality that you are going to see less, if not any, increase of bailouts in this government of national unity. Not only because from a policy perspective it's a bad idea to do bailouts, but simply because that even if there could be an unlikely appetite for that, the means are simply not available. You know, because when you do these bailouts, and I think in one conversation the Minister of Finance was saying, when he was sharing the figures that South Africa has spent in trying to save state-owned enterprises through these bailouts, that it went into, multiple billions. And what that does whenever it happens, it takes away from
progress.
It takes away from policing, health, teachers, social development.
Yeah, but it doesn't take away from blue lights. Yeah.
Now,
within that space of, let's call it the traditional media, I've made this point that I've lived under successive nationalist governments and they've operated the same, right? And the one thing that you could really not grasp from their cold, dead hands has been the media, right? So it was very difficult, to get TV licenses, TV operating licenses and broadcasting frequencies for radio, etc. While there's still a demand, do you see in your tenure that might be looked at? Because I know that this government has kept a very tight stranglehold on vernacular broadcasting and radio.
Yeah, so I want to make sure I understand your question properly. Are you saying that will we still see that there is a demand for issuing of more licenses in the radio space
radio,
in
and
particular?
perhaps even terrestrial television, if there is still such a thing?
Look, when you look, for instance, in terms of, the number of community radio stations, for instance, that have, been formed and emerged in the last 10 years, but equally so, look at the number of those that then subsequently closed afterwards because several of them, one can't keep up with the cost of their signal, for instance, or just don't simply have a sufficient pool of revenue to be self-sustainable. You realize that, that complicates things further. I think what we're going to see more and more is, the emergence of new markets. Podcasting has grown substantially in South Africa in the last 2 or 3 years. But I think, rather than, because if you observe, I don't think there's been even the issuing of so many commercial radio stations, for instance, in the last 5 years, in the last 2 to 3 years. So what you will see is a consolidation of what's in the space right now, and unless the market also takes takes a particular direction that can withstand the inroads that podcasting, for instance, and short form content consumption has made.
Yeah. Do you think that the prudent thing would be to start managing the exit from, the end of the SABC, lest it become another post office? Right? You're starting to see that, I'm saying, does one manage that exit, or does one hope that progress doesn't happen? Because one gets the feeling that some of that investment of our tax money in SABC, which, as you point out in the past, was maybe squandered. Maybe we get to the point where somebody says, this is starting to look like the post office looked 20 years ago. You could see the end in sight, but yet nobody wants to do anything about it.
I think that would be, unfortunately, informed by a very pessimistic, view towards SABC rather than the need for a public broadcaster. I think the conversation should be geared by, what type of a public broadcaster should the SABC be in response to the advances that are being made in the audio visual media space that is growing and challenging traditional media.
Yeah.
And in answering that question, I think you'll find value in the fact that there is a recognition, and I share the recognition for the need for a public broadcaster, because it also has a particular constitutional obligation to fulfill around universal access to news, information, and education.
Let's move out of the traditional media and let's talk about the medium that we are on. Recently, there was some controversy in the podcasting space, where on MacG's show, we've done some work with him. I've been on his show. Oddly enough, I think I raised the average age by quite a stretch, but he made a few unfortunate comments, and then suddenly everybody was off to the races. Should this be regulated? What should happen with podcasting, etc.? I seem to have come across an interview where you said you could be in favor of us looking at regulating podcasting. Is that your position or not?
That is not an accurate reflection of my position. I said, right, that every medium of media has a responsibility, whether it is for entertainment purposes, educational purposes, to ensure that its content is not harmful to the dignity of other people. That is not, that is just common decency, but that is also lawful behavior,
sure,
in the country. There is always the temptation to say that the best response to any national question being asked is that government must regulate. That is not always the best instruments to do so, particularly in recognition of what one of the most sacrosanct parts of our constitution advocates for, which is freedom of speech and its associated responsibilities, because too often there can be such a selective celebration of what freedom of speech means and how it should be exuded, but it comes with a responsibility. I think, Mike, for every podcaster, including you, when you set up a platform, you set up a platform with the purpose of a goal. And the goal, in your case, is to have, conversations with all South Africans in different spaces about the state of our country and how do we respond appropriately to some of the burning questions in our country. If this, and, God forbid, it never degenerates into that, starts becoming, a platform to spew vile diatribes, ad hominem attacks, misinformation, that represents a problem, and that problem is one that can be solved, right, through self-regulation, right, and can be solved through a general acceptance that there is a code of conduct that in which responsible media players should have. Because here's the other conversation that antagonists of any form of regulation advance in the podcasting space, right? Is that, we're not traditional media. Yes, you're not traditional media. You are playing in the space of technology that has evolved, and you are in the audiovisual space now, right? And while there's understanding that currently there is nothing in law that regulates that space, it is not then a license, to start impugning the dignity of people. And excuse me, this is not even about making a moral argument for citizen responsibility. It's about an acknowledgement, and that must be carried and exuded all the time, that these platforms means that you communicate with audiences and you communicate with the rest of the world. And there has to be an acceptance and understanding that it can't be used opportunistically to harm people or their persona.
Yeah. Well, I think that does definitely answer the question. So for now, we must just be podcasters should be aware. And I agree with you. I think that we don't want this to generate.
Just do the right thing.
Just do the right thing.
Just do the right thing. You all are adults enough to know what the right thing is.
Oddly enough, by this being such a free market instrument, there's almost better regulation than what you'd get if you had regulation, because literally people do not respond well to that kind of stuff.
Here's the thing that must equally be appreciated is whenever there's chaos, and I use chaos loosely, right, it's going to invite a response, because you can't, in moments of chaos, have a laissez-faire approach from government.
Yeah. Well, Minister Solly Malatsi, I know that you've got other appointments to keep. Thank you so much for fitting us in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering the questions. To everybody out there, support our supporters. Pace Car Rental. You can get a discount if you rent a car there, 10% if you use our code SONA to rent your car. Just book through their website. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel by now, you better hurry. We're on the road to 100,000. Thank you so much for joining us. To Minister Solly Malatsi, thank you for coming. And to everybody out there, thank you. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Every business needs a world-class video to show to your clients and prospective clients. When the Stream-In team isn't filming the State of the Nation, they are producing those world-class videos for companies just like yours. They have got all of the equipment, drones, microphones, whatever you need, and the technical know-how to film a proper video for your company. Visit their website.